So we keep hearing about the migration flow that has interested the Mediterranean in 2015 and 2016 from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean region. But as a matter of fact, there is a much bigger problem that interests the countries that surround Syria, such as Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Turkey. In order to understand better this phenomenon, the Middle East Centre has organized a workshop that brings together academic and policymakers, and as well as members of the civil society, in order to discuss constructively the kind of response that host states have developed towards the Syrian emergency in their respective countries. The region has been influenced by forced migrations for decades, even centuries. And in order to better understand and explain the way in which the dynamics of the Syrian refugee crisis has unfolded in this region, we need to look back also at the previous experiences of forced displacements that have been taking place.
Most of the movement came between 1880 and 1920. About 4 million Circassians, Chechens, Albanians, Kosovar. Later on you had the Armenians and the Kurds. Understanding that older set of waves helps you to understand why refugees from Syria fled to where they did, why those from the area around Aleppo and Idlib went to Hatay and to Turkey. The most important thing to recognize is that most Syrians who came to Lebanon already came to a place that they knew from the past that they had worked in, because before the crisis actually broke, we know that around 500,000 Syrians were workers in Lebanon. They were basically the backbone of the construction industry and also the agricultural industry.
In the early phase of the crisis, most of these countries have been extremely hospitable and receptive towards Syrian refugees, and that allowed basically to Syrians to get into these countries quite easily, especially in the first 2 years of the crisis. That has basically meant that millions and millions, almost 5 million Syrians arrived in each of these countries. But that has posed, in a longer-term perspective, enormous challenges in the political, in the social and the economic level for each of the host states' countries.
It's really great impact on all the aspects of our lives in Lebanon. Maybe the most flagrant ones are the economic one. We're talking about a loss of about $15 billion direct loss to our economy. We're also talking about a lot of social implications today in Lebanon. We have an increased number of children in the streets. We have a lot of child labor. We have unprecedented cases of trafficking.
The only issue is the financing of these programs, which is the main difficulty, and it makes the life of the people, even not the refugee and IDPs, it has affected the host communities as well, that vulnerability is increasing and accessing the market, job opportunities. And for long-term issue, this is the main challenging issue, how to make the livelihoods and other essentials to be provided to the host community and the IDPs and refugees.
Syrians want to claim their lives back. They want to reobtain their autonomy and their capacity to provide for themselves and from their families.
And the role of the informal mechanisms and the role of the informal networks in helping Syrian refugees as well as Lebanese host communities in accessing health or accessing education or finding a job, although it's informal, have been crucial in maintaining certain level of normalcy among the Syrian refugee communities as well as their host communities.
I think generally their objectives could be grouped into two areas. One is impacting the lives of other refugees in the community in the host state, or impacting developments inside Syria. So some of the ways that they do this are engaging in humanitarian relief, service provision, and sometimes it's more explicit political engagement. They often team up with humanitarian actors, and so certainly they can benefit the lives of others in these small ways.
One of the key aspects that concerns the agency of refugees is regard to their possibility to work. Not all states are equally available to let Syrian work in their country.
Refugees need to be able to provide for themselves. But another issue is also that humanitarian aid is dwindling. As in any major refugee crisis which is protracted, there is donor fatigue, less and less resources available for supporting the refugees. Hence, self-reliance needs to be really explored as a solution for refugees throughout the Middle East. In general, most host countries allow Syrian refugees to work informally to various degrees. That's the case in Kurdistan, that's certainly the case in Turkey, in Lebanon, and hence, in my perspective, I believe that it is more important to ensure that informal labor is not criminalized.
You can't take possibilities of refugees working in isolation. There's a couple of contextual matters you first have to acknowledge. One being that it's in the context of host countries where there is unemployment, and so the concept of expanding the economy and benefits for the local population has to be acknowledged.
Syrian refugees' displacement has not only been an issue for host states and for Syrians themselves, but also international organizations had to adapt progressively to a situation that was constantly changing, and from a short-term situation has muted into a long-term situation.
It became very clear in the second year of the crisis that we needed to have a dual approach, and beyond humanitarian assistance, we needed to have resilience, a stabilization approach for the countries in the region, because these countries are fragilized by the war next door and by the large-scale presence of refugees in their country. If we don't address that, there is no way the response to refugee and the humanitarian response can be sustainable. So we need to have a parallel approach.
I think there has, yes, been a very clear recognition that the crisis was going to last. First with the refugees themselves, but actors quickly realized at the end of 2014 that it was imperative to move away from an emergency response focused on saving lives and contending with the most urgent humanitarian needs to an approach that was taking full account that refugees would not be in position in conditions of safety and dignity to return to Syria soon.
Among the main issues that affect the situation of Syrians in neighboring countries is the situation of their legal status.
It's true that most of them haven't signed the 1951 convention, and they don't have a comprehensive law that deals with asylum, but they actually have in their legal framework a lot of provisions that can deal with refugees. So refugee protection in the Middle East is not operating in a complete legal vacuum.
If we look, for example, at the cases of Turkey and Morocco, because those are two countries that have changed their legal systems towards refugees in the past couple of years, both actually in 2013, there is a convergence because various institutions, especially the IOM and the UNHCR, have been really influential.
One aspect that is strictly related to the legal status of Syrians as refugees is the situation of statelessness.
When I was in Lebanon, I was surprised to find the amount of Kurdish stateless people in Lebanon as well. We talked a little bit about informal tent settlements before, complete settlements made up of stateless Kurds.
Immediate protectionary concerns that face Syrians, refugees who are also stateless. And that can be the issue of entering a country illegally, for example. That can be the issue of access to certain rights.
There is a perception of vulnerability that is very much attached to gender and age.
So it's true that 75% of Syrian refugees are women and children, but because there's about 50% of the refugees are children and 50% are adults, that means that 75% of the refugees are also men and children. And then when we think about who is vulnerable, and if we look statistically, the vast majority of people who have died are men.
If you now ask the majority of Syrians, they really hope to go back to their homes, up to their own country, because they do belong to that place. We all know that the conflict in Syria would come to an end. So having this prospect that, okay, after the war, the war ends, the reconstruction of the country. So this means like building capacities of the Syrians to take the lead in the reconstruction era, the reconstruction phase.
One important issue, and that I think would be the nature of the solution by which the Syrians will be going back. It would depend largely on the political arrangement that would allow create the context for Syrians to go. The political arrangement means a solution that it is inclusive, that it takes into consideration the main concerns of all Syrians.
I think no one would dispute the fact that the Syrian refugee crisis is an enormous challenge for neighboring countries. And unfortunately, we will be one that, in terms of time, will be protracted. So we have tried to identify what are the main actions that, at least in part, can address some of the issues that this crisis is raising in those countries. I think that these actions may render the life of Syrians better, and the presence of Syrians in those communities more sustainable.